Well, you will recall at the end of our last class, we actually had made a significant change. And we started to talk about what's called positive psychology. And this comes from this article I mentioned by Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi in the American Psychologist. And if you remember, you know, what was unusual was that our language changed so much. We began talking about all kinds of positive attributes, whereas before, you know, we had been talking mostly about symptoms. And I mentioned that in positive psychology now, there really is an emphasis on trying to do research on all the strengths people have. That is to try to look at the fact that people may make better adjustments and certainly lead more fulfilling lives if we really focus on those things that are helpful to them. That is, if we focus on strengths, how you build strengths, how you build virtues, how you become an effective person interpersonally, let's say, rather than to study why someone is an ineffective person interpersonally. And while, you know, some might argue that this is kind of similar. I mean, you know, you're studying interpersonal functioning, but it is different to put your emphasis on trying to examine, like, why is someone dysfunctional interpersonally versus to put the emphasis on what is it that people do that make them effective interpersonally. So this is not just a game of semantics. This really does make a difference. Now, also, you know, some believe that if we could create a world where the emphasis was on positive attributes, that is, if we could promote more positive functioning, then, you know, you would find that a lot of psychopathologies might be avoided. It's an interesting premise, you know, that if we're building a culture that, let's say, perhaps is more supportive, a culture in which people feel safer, a culture in which you know, people can learn to grow and where growthful activities are encouraged, that perhaps you know, people would find it, people wouldn't develop some of the symptoms they do. And I remember a very interesting case that developed, or that I heard about. I was at a conference on the treatment of the seriously mentally ill. And this clinician got up and he was describing a person he had followed in New York. This woman lived in an Italian community. She herself was very Italian. And they had decided to knock down the houses, and it was a poor area. And so they relocated the people who lived in the community. And this woman ended up living in quite a different community. And people began to notice a lot of eccentric behavior with her. They brought her to the state hospital. They actually admitted her to the state hospital. And she spent some time there. Then she was released to a halfway house, which was typical of what they did in state hospitals. They didn't want someone to have to re-enter the community without some support, so they sent them to a supportive environment, namely a halfway house. Well, this woman, when she would get in the halfway house, people found her disruptive. People found her very emotional. People found she talked a lot. She did not make it there. And so they readmitted her to the state hospital. And this kind of thing went on a couple of times. And then, you know, this enterprising clinician began looking at this woman's history and noticed that here is someone who is like 55 years old. Prior to her leaving the community she had been in, there is no indication that this woman ever was seen as having any significant emotional problem. Never hospitalized, never in psychotherapy. And the person began wondering, you know, like, well, what happened? And what he noted was this one change in her life. That is, that she had to leave the community that she was in. And actually, he began noticing that the halfway house, certainly the state hospital, but the halfway house was very unlike the culture she had come from. So he finds an Italian community in New York and finds a place where there's an inexpensive place to live. And they relocate this woman when they release her from the hospital, not to the halfway house, but into an Italian community. And this clinician, by the way, himself was Italian. And so he enjoyed following up on this woman. And what he reported was, once she was back in that community, she never had any problems again. That is, never had any problems that would come to the attention of the mental health world, because the style she had of being, very emotional, very talkative, getting very excited about things, perhaps being a bit pushy, that in that community, nobody thought that was strange. No one would report this woman's behavior as at all bizarre. And what's important about that is that, sometimes we are much too aggressive at labeling people who aren't quite the way we are as somehow being disturbed. And as we go on and we talk about, mental health systems, by the way, you'll see that there are very good reasons for why we have made it much more difficult to commit someone to a state hospital. It wasn't that long ago that almost any member of the family could commit any other member of the family by simply bringing somebody to the state hospital and saying, this person needs to be here. We will discuss why that happens and also the complexities of that. But people who should never have been in hospitals ended up in hospitals. And we have at times not been sensitive enough to a lot of the aspects of someone's personality. In fact, aspects that in one culture are strengths, and then in another culture are seen as deviant. Now, there also are two other goods that would come from our thinking more positively. We would be taking people who don't have deficits. I mean, currently, our thinking has been so much about psychopathology that you have to have a deficit in order for us to be interested in you. Positive psychology is saying we actually ought to also focus on all the so-called normal people, and many of them want to develop strengths, be more effective, to develop virtues or abilities that would be very helpful to them. And by thinking this way, we can help such people. Also, if you do that, then many people will become more productive. And people who have potential, that is somebody who perhaps has a real ability to lead, let's say, if they really had a sense of leadership fostered in them, and if we were willing to teach people some of the skills you need, excuse me, in being a leader, these people might become leaders. Currently, we just don't focus enough in our culture on all of those, many positive attributes we've been discussing. And so there's a feeling, and I think it's well supported, that for some people, they never achieve the potential they really have. And part of the reason can be, no one has ever really helped them with that. And in some cases, no one ever suggested to the person that they might have skills and abilities far beyond, what they have. We saw this actually. I remember when I was working in a mental health center, one of the secretaries was incredibly bright and talented. She was a very ethnic person, married, really playing, the role of being the wife. She was also, the husband was in school, so she was, the breadwinner. But, that's really what she was going to do. And many of us started noticing qualities like she was very empathic with patients, very comfortable in relating to people who had extreme symptoms. And she began also recognizing some of this in herself, but the people around her began saying, have you ever thought about perhaps entering clinical psychology? And, she thought, well, I mean, that's just not something that I ever thought about. But people began encouraging her, Well, she decided to apply to graduate school, and indeed she got in. Indeed, she got a PhD, and indeed she is a very effective person today. That was a chance thing. Had that woman chosen to become a secretary, perhaps at an oil company, no one may ever have really encouraged all of this talent in her. And there are kind of untold stories like this. Certainly, some of you probably can look at your grandparents, especially if your grandparents weren't very educated. And so in my case, my grandparents, my wife's grandparents were not very educated. What we recognize is they were very bright. I mean, they did not get degrees. They didn't even get out of grade school. But there's no question that a lot of potential was lost because they came from a very ethnic culture that didn't encourage them to develop their strengths. No one paid much attention to their strengths. They simply fulfilled roles. Positive psychology is trying to say we're missing a tremendous amount of talent by this focus on people's deficits, and then if you have a deficit, we try to get you to be so-called normal. And we also have to start looking at the so-called normal and how this person might function a lot better if we simply provided a learning environment that allowed them to acquire more. Now, we can look at positive psychology from a number of perspectives, and I'm going to choose 3. First of all, there's positive experience. What makes one moment better than the next? Now, think about this yourself. When this question is asked, you think about it. I mean, you say to yourself, yeah, I can recognize, some moments are better than others. But if I ask you, what will you tell me? What does make one moment better than the next? I mean, what would change, your experience of today? Think about it. Give me one answer. What would change? What do you think does change the world for you? I mean, what do you think happens that you feel differently from one moment to the next? Now, surely you can think of something.
Anything can make you feel different.
Okay. So by anything, maybe you're saying that stimuli have the potential. Okay. Now let's put labels on that. What kind of stimuli?
I think that if from moment to moment something can be more desirable to you, it can change the way you feel about the next one.
Okay.
Such as I could win the lottery in the next hour or so, versus now I'm broke.
Okay. Okay. You used an example, but it's an exceptional one, eh? It's a surprise, but it's a huge surprise. I mean, that takes place. So something can happen that you feel would change your life. Okay. How about something more subtle? What kinds of things, will change you from moment to moment?
Novel, emotional, and physical stimuli.
Yeah. Something new happens to you. So if the new thing is good, is positive, then you can find yourself feeling, I feel a lot better now. Let's say, somebody just walked over and they hugged you. And somebody you really like. And you feel, oh, I am so glad this person hugged me. I like this person. On the other hand, let's say that same person, you happen to meet as you're walking out, and the person snubs you. And you felt all along, you're kind of good friends, and the person walks by, doesn't say hello. So, 60 seconds ago, you would have said, I like this person, we're friends. 60 seconds later, you're feeling, I wonder why this person snubbed me. So, there are events that occur, and they're occurring all the time. We don't spend enough time, though, examining like which of those events are really meaningful for you. Now, one you can think of that might, change you from time to time. Actually, it can happen quick. If you want to take a broad category, it would be information. You learn something new, and whatever it is that you learn may either cause you to feel very good, or it may cause you to not feel good. And the same information can differ from person to person. For example, if we walk out of class today and it's pouring rain, some of you may respond, kind of angrily, I hate rain. I don't want to go out there and get drenched. I've got to get somewhere right away. This is very inopportune. And all of a sudden, and you may have walked out of here actually feeling pretty good, and suddenly, you're irked by the fact that it's raining. The person you are with may say, oh, thank heavens it's raining. My flowers were getting dried up, my lawn was getting dried up, and now, this is going to be very helpful. So it's the same event, it's the same information, but depending on the person, you can have very different emotional responses. So it's important for us, to be careful about stereotyping things. They're often an event for one person is quite differently experienced than an event for another person. Information for one person may be experienced differently than information for another person. Let's take our person that an individual runs into. One person may find out that person doesn't like me, and that's very upsetting to me. The person's companion may say, I could care less what that person thinks about me. I have no interest. So, it depends on the kind of information, it depends on the kind of value we put on it, depends on the kind of value we put on certain experiences. That will determine, whether or not something is good or bad. And as a result, we find that one moment really can be better than the next. We can determine it to some degree. And also, we can change it by, knowing how to respond to information that is either good or not good. Now, second is the question, what makes a positive personality? Okay, what does make a positive personality? Let us find out from a class filled with talented personalities. What do you think makes a positive personality? Surely, Mr. Edmond.
Somebody who's like really agreeable or nice, outgoing but friendly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're feeling one thing about personality is that the person is agreeable, friendly, person reaches out. These are very desirable qualities. Okay? What else might you posit makes a positive personality? Sure, Mr. Opuni?
I think maybe like no matter what happens in their outside environment, they'll always remain like their well-being's always intact. They're not deterred. I guess the typical positive, like not happy like with disregard to their environment around them, but if things are going good or bad in the outside environment, they still have this even.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying if someone's pretty steady, that even though things happen that perhaps might be a bit upsetting, that doesn't cause them to make great changes. Or if good things happen, they accommodate those things nicely. But your personality is someone, they're pretty predictable. They're a pretty steady person. You can count on them. Okay? Ms. Hofstadter, you were going to.
You said exactly what I was going to say, and you said it better. I was just going to say someone, that always had a positive outlook, that not every situation was a crisis for them. They were comfortable with whatever came. It wasn't overwhelming to them. It was just, positive outlook, something that they could do with.
Okay. So you're saying that people who have a certain optimism, people who can take things and use them to their advantage, and they don't get too upset about them. Anything else? Any other quality you can think about that you think makes for a positive personality?
I think you have to feel good about yourself.
Okay. Maybe that's the first one, eh? Is
Feel good about yourself.
okay. And, you know, Ms. Bro brings up, you know, what may be the basic premise, which is you've got to start with yourself, and you've kind of got to feel that, you know, this is, you know, I feel good about myself. This is the way I am, but this is okay. Now, you notice, if you look at the descriptors we've gotten, there are certain things we don't want to see in a personality that we certainly wouldn't call positive. What are the implications for what we don't want to see by what we just said we want to see? What don't we want to see?
Disregard for other people.
Okay. Mr. Jones says, we don't want to see a disregard for other people. That certainly seems very reasonable. What else don't we want to see? Or what else is implied by?
I would say an angry person, a person
Aha.
who's negative all the time, a person that looks down on others.
Great. Sure. The way in which we have been talking, if we want to see somebody who is likable and constant and reaches out, what we're saying is we don't want people who are hostile, people who are unpredictable, people who are unpleasant, people who are interpersonally negative. So, you know, and the reason why I think it's important to look at both sides of that is, if I were to ask you, well, why don't I do it? Tell me about a negative personality. What can you tell me about negative personalities? What are things you don't like, or you think other people don't like?
Well, I think I'm kind of having a negative personality about the test. Just be more positive about it.
Ms. Bro, you're not feeling good about the test is probably not a personality characteristic. What else, though? What kinds of things do you think are negative attributes of personality? Sure.
Yeah, well, you mentioned like about some qualities like courage, you know, love and vocation, but so this being like the opposite of that, you know, displaying cowardice. He's saying like no interpersonal skills, just being isolated individual. Because he said like you have an individual quality as well as qualities, connection with other people, you know.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Sure, being cowardly, being interpersonally ineffective, perhaps being hostile. Now, the reason why I said that, and I actually thought you might come up with more things, people typically are able to, you know, kind of describe negatives about people. I mean, usually when you say to someone like, what's negative about people? You know, people can usually pretty quickly identify things that upset them. We tend to be that way. We know those things that we don't like. Now, we know the things that we like, but often we have to do more thinking about it. And in our culture, and certainly in the field of psychology, we haven't spent nearly the time on talking about these strengths and these likable qualities as we've spent, you know, really trying to study problems. Now, one of the things about a positive personality, that this variable, is that it focuses on empowering people. That is, if you're going to try to improve people, you want to create a positive approach. The first thing you have to do is empower people, and you know that's the thing. Ms. Bro made this case that you have to like yourself. I mean, that's the beginning. You know, once you like yourself, then we have to begin to ask you, what are some of the things you might like to even improve in yourself, and then that becomes the thing that this focus on. And so, some of the things you might teach someone are things like, how how human beings become self-organizing, how they become self-directive, and how they adapt to whatever kinds of issues come before them. Those are important skills. Often our focus is, if something new happens to you and you don't collapse, that is, we don't have to take care of you, we don't pay a lot of attention to you. We don't pay attention to whether or not you actually took this new experience and used it as an initiative, that you got stronger, that you got better, that good things occurred for you. So it really is important that we recognize that there is a vast world that psychology should deal with, and it hasn't quite got there yet. Okay, now, the next perspective, or the third variable here, is recognition that people and experiences are embedded in a social context. Thus, what this really means is that positive psychology needs to take positive communities and positive institutions into account. And you can see in the example I was giving you about this Italian woman who ended up in a state hospital, for her, her ethnic community obviously had been a very positive force for her throughout her life. I mean, she did fine. As far as anybody could see, she never had a problem. But when she lost, all that support, she lost that environment that was really helpful to her, she couldn't look around and adjust to new expectations. So she remained the person that she was, and that person ends up getting extruded from the new environment. And we need to look at environments like, why do people have such difficulty taking in someone who's new, someone who's different, someone whose mannerisms and style and customs perhaps are not the same. We talk about it, but we haven't really studied it enough to be able to make changes. Now, there's a psychologist named David Buss who actually has written on evolutionary perspectives that influence positive psychology. And what he kind of notes is like, the dead hand of the past weighs very heavily on the present. And he focuses primarily on three reasons why positive states of mind are so elusive. And you want to remember now that this is a person coming from almost an evolutionary or ecological perspective. And so he says, because the environments that people currently live in are so different from their ancestral environments to which their bodies and minds have been adapted, they often are misfits in modern surroundings. Now, for those of you who've taken personality theory, you will have studied Carl Jung. This has some of that collective unconscious that Carl Jung talks about. That is, in Jung, when you're born, you're not just an empty vehicle that's going to learn from birth. Instead, his belief was you had what he called archetypes, ancestral archetypes, that is, experiences that took place in your ancestors actually are available to you. And what we have here is Buss saying we may have adjusted to societies in the past, and the dramatic changes that are going on for us now, we're not prepared to deal with. Now, the second one is that evolved distress mechanisms are often functional. And distress mechanisms, he happened to use that term. Other people would use other terms. But one example he used was that if you're in a culture where you value loved ones, let's say especially you value a very special loved one, but loved ones don't necessarily remain very faithful to each other, then what you develop is a sense of jealousy. And you develop this jealousy because you worry so much that someone will steal your loved one, or that your loved one will be unfaithful to you, will become involved with another person. And he was saying, you know, from his perspective, you really wouldn't have to have jealousy. I mean, jealousy is not just an emotion that everybody necessarily experiences. He sees it as a mechanism for coping. That is, someone becomes suspicious about what their most important person is up to because they've developed great fears that they will lose them. One could argue both pro and con, whether or not that really is a mechanism that develops that way. Then the third is that selection tends to be competitive, and it involves a zero-sum outcome. What we mean by this is that if you recall in some of our theories, we posited you only have a certain amount of energy. And so if you have to put a lot of your energy into a world to protect yourself, that is, you feel you got to be competitive with a lot of other people, you feel you got to devote a lot of energy into looking out for those things that are of value to you, that doesn't leave you with a lot of energy to devote to growthful things, like we've been talking about. And so he is really saying, becomes important that you have as much energy freed up as possible so you can devote it to really being a growthful person. Now, Buss does make a number of interesting observations. One is that today people live surrounded by many more people than their ancestors did. And I think we can certainly see that. I mean, you did not have these huge cities historically that we have now. Yet he would say, while people are surrounded by many more people now than their ancestors were, people tend to be intimate with fewer individuals, and that people probably experience more loneliness and alienation today than they experienced in smaller communities. Now, this phenomena is one I think it's easy to recognize. If you happen to come from a small town, one of the things you probably would say is, everybody in our town knew everybody else. I mean, you couldn't hide in the town. Everybody knew everybody by name if it's a small town, and people talked to each other. But there was lots of social interaction. On the other hand, in Houston, you could live in a high-rise building that had 2,000 people in it and not know anybody. You could be in your apartment and nobody pays attention to you. You get on the elevator, you run into various people every day, but nobody responds. So you could be living in a fairly large community in a very tight environment, a 1 square block environment, and you've got hundreds of people, and you don't know any of them. And none of them seem to be interested in getting to know you. And I remember at another university I was at, I was talking to a student who happened to be the student government president. And she was telling me, what she had learned about, being at the university. And one of the things was, she said, she came from a town whose population was smaller than the dorm in which she lived. So on the campus, she said, just her dorm alone was a bigger population than the entire town she came from. And she said it was really a great learning for her, because even though she became very popular, she realized how many people, even in the dorm, she didn't know, and how many people didn't seem to really be very eager to get to know her. And she said, in the town she came from, that just couldn't happen. I mean, everybody would say hello. Everybody would know your name. Now, Buss also notes that psychological choices do involve the need to reproduce optimal experiences. That is, if good things happen to you, you want to make them happen again. And what he said is that healthy people, whenever possible, choose behaviors that make them feel fully alive, and make them feel competent, and make them feel creative. And of course, this is a very different focus than examining what causes individuals, to be depressed or to be anxious. But we spend much more of our time with the latter. Now, in positive psychology, there are a number of personal traits that contribute to our well-being. And you'll see, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these. There's subjective well-being, there's optimism, there's happiness, there's self-determinism. Now, subjective well-being refers to what people think and how they feel about their lives. It refers to the cognitive and affective conclusions they reach when they evaluate their existence. Now, even the ancient philosophers had some insight into this area. Pre-Christian philosophers, for example, agreed it is not what happens to people that determines how happy they are, but rather it's how people interpret what happens to them that creates their happiness. And if you recall, a couple lectures ago, I gave you this example. You have two women who go to a party, and this guy walks in. And one woman sees this guy as having a very nice smile, highly desirable person. The other woman sees the guy having a smirk. Now, you've got two people, you've got the same experience, you've got an unknown other person, so we have no idea what this guy is really like. But the openness of one person to see positive things is going to allow her to go over and perhaps, introduce herself and begin a conversation. The other person is going to protect herself. But there's a cost to protecting yourself, because it means then you don't reach out. You don't try to get to know somebody else. So the mechanism that seems to be self-protective, in fact, you could say it is self-protective, but it's not self-protective at no cost. Actually, if one continues this kind of style, it's self-protective at significant cost. Now, one dispositional trait that appears to mediate between external events and a person's interpretation of them is optimism. The question is, how does optimism work? And if you have it, how can it be increased? And you also have to ask the question, when does optimism distort reality? Who knows what a Pollyanna is? What's a Pollyanna? Ah, yes, Mr. Jones says a goody-goody girl, exactly. And when you say goody-goody girl, what are you saying about her? I mean, what's your kind of fantasy about? What's this person like?
Prudish and kind of, I don't know, prim and proper.
Okay, prudish, prim and proper. Okay, there are even more characteristics. What else can you think? Surely you've heard the term used. She's a Pollyanna. And usually it could be used for a male, but it's almost always used for a female. But the personality characteristics are not really gender determined. What is it? There are all the things that Mr. Jones just said. Okay? This is the person who smiles no matter what's happening. This person can only see a positive side of things. Now, this is someone, and I think you described this well, we tend to think of her as superficial. You don't see much depth in this person. In fact, in spite of the fact that this person only does positive things, I mean, she's always happy, always smiling, always saying good things, actually, a lot of people are bugged by her. There's a sense that this is unreal, that she can only experience one side of life, and not very deeply. So when you look at optimism, I mean, you have to look at it as, is it a genuine quality? Is the person really optimistic? That is, they have evaluated what's going on. They're able to respond to good things. Not that it is an automatic kind of fixed smile and way of relating to life. Now, we do know, though, that real optimism is linked to many positive outcomes in our lives, in fact, in our everyday life. In fact, people are more and more coming to believe that that if they really do think something can happen, it will actually contribute to their being successful. That is often, you even hear people say things like, believe in it. Believe in yourself. If you believe in yourself, good things can happen. And actually, if you're not optimistic, it doesn't take a lot to figure out, maybe you won't put the energy, into something that you really could do well and be successful. So optimism is important. Then happiness is another important variable for positive psychology. And some aspects of it, really are not very fashionable. One is, the often found association between happiness and religion. Today where many people are leaving their religions or just don't participate in religion, some people even are angry with religions. But we do find, to be very honest, that those people who partake and involve themselves in some kind of religion or some kind of spiritual life tend to experience a happiness from it. They tend to get good things from it. Obviously, though, those people who don't get that leave it. So those who are left, who are still participants, are finding this is very helpful to them.
Isn't happiness kind of contingent on the first two traits we just talked about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to be optimistic first, or you're not going to be a happy person. You've got to believe you're going to be happy. And certainly, there has to be a certain, subjective sense that, you're a good person. Yeah, that's a very good point. And you could say some of these things do kind of unfold one into the other. Now, also, there's been a strong relationship has been shown between personal relationships and happiness. And, if you don't have some very real friends that you feel good about, they feel good about you, that does get in the way of happiness. And friendship is so important that what we have found in studies is there's a high correlation between having good best friends, perhaps intimate friends, caring friends, and your happiness. And in spite of what our culture, brings before us, we find very little correlation between the amount of wealth or goods you have and whether you're happy. And in fact, if you look at these studies, what happens is, and if you remember, in Maslow's hierarchy, there are certain things you have to have in your life. You have to have warmth. You need to have food. You need to not be thirsty, starving. You need to have a place to live. If those things are lost to you, you don't have them, then you won't be happy. So there's kind of a baseline. You've got to have enough of this world's goods so that you can feel, minimally safe. I have a place to go home to. I can eat tonight. If I wanted to go out, let's say, to a movie or something like that, I have enough resources. Now, once you get past that kind of minimal level, it's very interesting. The studies show that there's not a whole lot of relationship between gathering a lot more money, let's say having enough money that you can do anything you want, and whether you're happy. And, we certainly, with modern television, kind of almost adore, if you look at a lot of the shows that are on, wealth. People really having a lot of wealth. But the fact is, there's not any indication that many of those people are really enjoying their life much. Some are getting married and divorced at a very rapid pace. And when you read sometimes about how they got to know somebody and how they got married, you realize the relationship was incredibly superficial. People hardly knew each other. It takes them about 2 weeks to get to know each other a little better. That's enough time for them to get divorced. And yet these people have tremendous resources, And so it's an interesting phenomenon that happiness seems to be quite independent of really how many economic resources you have. That your income, once it gets to a certain very modest level, becomes not a determiner of whether or not you're going to have an enjoyable life. Now then, there's self-determination. And self-determination theory investigates three related human needs. One is the need for competency. And, you know, here, there's not much question. You have to be a believer that, you know, you actually are going to be able to accomplish whatever it is you wish. That is, you have to believe, I do have the internal resources to get done certain things. And so the first step, and this I think is hierarchical too, as Mr. Jones had just pointed out, you got to have this first thing. That is, you got to have this sense of competence. But that's not enough, because what that progresses to is you then have to have a feeling that you belong. And you know, we all feel that need. I mean, we, as much sometimes as people want to say, you know, I don't need others. That's always untrue. You know, there's no one who really can lead, at least very rare, anybody leads a totally isolated life. Even if you look at, you know, maybe the extreme, there are some monks, you know, who go off and they lead very ascetic lives. In the extreme, there are these monks who, you know, live in poverty. They have their own little hut on the side of a hill. You know, they belong to a religious order, but each monk kind of has, you know, his own little place, and they never talk, and they work the land. But even with that situation, those people come together for common prayer. They are perceived as part of a community, and they know they're part of a community, and that's important to them. So the idea is, no matter how extreme you want to get, the reality is, if you're honest, you'll admit, I need to belong. So the kind of choices you make are very important. That leads to the next issue. That is, in self-determination theory, you also need to be autonomous. That is, you need to belong, but you also need to be able to make your own decisions. So if there's too big a price for belonging, that is, you have to give up yourself. That, you know, you feel, I cannot be the me I would like to be. Then you have a real problem. And that's very difficult because the need to belong is very intense in all of us. The ability to belong to something where you don't lose yourself, where you can also be yourself, is the key to whether you're going to be really happy. Now, when these needs are satisfied, personal well-being and social development at least become optimized. Persons that are in the state that we've been describing now are intrinsically motivated. And very importantly, they're at a state where they can really fulfill their own potentials. And they're able to seek out progressively greater challenges. Now, self-determination also involves a certain autonomy. And this is a tricky area. In one case, the emphasis is on autonomy in our culture. Actually, the emphasis on autonomy in our culture can be a kind of tyranny. That is, you know, an excessive freedom that actually in many people leads to dissatisfaction and depression. If you are so autonomous that you don't get help from others, if you're so autonomous that, I mean, you feel you've got to make every single decision yourself, no one gives you guidance, no one gives you much support, actually, being autonomous becomes a burden. And for some people, the responsibility that they begin to feel, because everything that they do, they feel is their, you know, they have to do, the responsibility gets very heavy. And the strange thing is that if you're so autonomous that you are not incorporated into some kind of a culture where you get feedback and where people are helpful to you, and yet people let you do the things that you want to do, if you don't have that kind of surrounding, actually you get depressed and you develop symptoms. It's a very complicated issue, and it's a very tricky issue. So what all of us need to do is to understand there are cultural constraints. And actually, cultural constraints are really necessary for leading a meaningful life, and also they're very necessary for leading a satisfying life. So the there is a real delicate balance and a delicate difference between cultural constraints that actually are informative to you, that create support for you, that kind of guide you and give you a sense of where it's probably best to go, versus cultural constraints that inhibit you, that keep you from being as much of a person as you could be. And that's kind of the part of the process of self-discovery, which is discovery of how you function in society. Now, positive psychology also has implications for mental and physical health. A person named George Vaillant, and Vaillant is spelled V-A-I-L-L-A-N-T. And George Vaillant pointed out that positive psychology actually has many implications for mental and physical health through the whole life cycle. And he emphasized that a positive psychological adaptation is something that actually unfolds as life goes on. It's not like, you have it and you want to hold on to it. It's that if you are really a developing human being, then you will begin to unfold, and you'll become more and more positive as you move on. And he even commented on things that he called mature defenses. And these are very different than others you've heard about. He talked about altruism, that being able to care about society actually is an important, what he called defense, that enables you to really participate in society. He felt you have to have some ability to suppress. That is, you can't just let out every feeling you have. He also felt that things like humor and anticipation are very important if you're going to work well in any society. And he felt that it's these mechanisms that actually contribute to a successful and to a joyful life. And when we talk about these, what makes them complicated is we sometimes use the same word for something that either could be enhancing to us, or at the same time, it could be problematic to us. And so we have to be able to figure out whether or not, how much of something works for us, and when that very variable has now begun to get in our way. Well, now in our next class, we're going to continue a little bit of this, and then we're going to get into the fascinating world of assessment and diagnosis. But we'll take a break for now.